This video will cover the phenotype of Proto-Semites from an Old Earth perspective. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. Proto-Semites. What did they look like? In order to answer this question, let's go back to the ancestors of Proto-Semites, the Basal Eurasians. We talked about the Basal Eurasians, an ancient Middle Eastern population that indigenous Middle Easterns are still related to. High levels of basal Eurasian ancestry were found in ancient Middle Eastern genomes, which negatively correlated with Neanderthal ancestry. Basal Eurasians may have less Neanderthal ancestry than other ancestral Eurasian lineages, and the extent to which basal Eurasian ancestry is present may explain the extent to which Neanderthal ancestry is present in Middle Eastern genomes. For example, a high level of basal Eurasian or sub-Saharan African ancestry could be the underlying reason for the low level of Neanderthal ancestry in Qatari Bedouin in comparison to Europeans or other Middle Eastern populations. Bedouin, who have the highest amount of autochthonous Arab genetic ancestry, may be the direct descendants of Basal Eurasians. So basically, Basal Eurasian ancestry is seen in ancient Middle Eastern genomes, and autochthonous Arab genetics is seen in the Bedouin people, and autochthonous being indigenous. So basal Eurasians play a very important role when it comes to both ancient Middle Eastern genomes and indigenous Middle Easterners today. But what did the ancestors of indigenous Middle Eastern Semitic populations look like? Understanding the phenotype of these ancient populations can give us an idea of what the Israelites may have looked like and how the descendants of Israel could look if they remained homogeneous. So, what did basal Eurasians look like? This paper deals with the phenotype when it comes to basal Eurasians. From this published Nature paper, it points to basal Eurasians resemble Africans or the Paleolithic Europeans. The study is called Levantine Cranium from Manto Cave in Israel foreshadows the first European human, modern humans. And so it says it is similar in shape to recent African skulls as well as to European skulls from the Upper Paleolithic period. And as you can see to the right of the screen, this is a Upper Paleolithic girl made by Tom Bajontud. And sorry if that was a mispronunciation, but this is how Upper Paleolithic people would have looked like. And they're saying that basal Eurasians look like Paleolithic individuals. And so these are all representations of Paleolithic, ancient Paleolithic populations. Basically, they had brown skin, dark, seemingly uh, possibly curly or wavy type of hair texture. So they looked like recent Africans from what we just read, and they looked like Upper Paleolithic Europeans. Upper Paleolithic Europeans basically had brown skin to black skin and black hair. Basal Eurasians looked no different than Africans and dark-skinned human populations. So Ibero-Maurusians is another ancient population that indigenous Middle Easterners descend from, and from North Africa is one of the best origins for Semites. As this paper says, East Arabians also displayed the highest level of the basal Eurasian lineage of all tested modern human populations. Not surprisingly, East Arabians were also the ones with higher similarity with Ibero-Maurusians, who were so far the best proxy for the basal Eurasians amongst the known ancient specimens. And remember, North Africa is one of the believed origins of Semites. This book covers it. This implies that the speakers of Proto-Semitic were still dwelling in Africa in the 5th millennium BC in the Neolithic subplume, when the Sahara's climate was much wetter, so that erosion took place as in other moist temperature or subtropical regions, and there was a proper system of rivers and vegetation consisting of grass with trees. So, what did Ibero-Maurusians look like? Since indigenous Middle Easterners would descend from or have Ibero-Maurusian ancestry, and Semites could have originated from the Neolithic North Africa. So the Saharan Ethiopid type is one good example. Ethiopid type that was more common during the Neolithic when the Sahara was still green, as we just read. Basically, reddish brown to black skin, tight curly hair, dolichoso-mesophalic skull structure. So this is one example what the ancestors of Middle Easterners could have looked like. And then here are Ibero-Maurusian reconstructions. And here is Ibero-Maurusian man and woman. The Kifian culture is a prehistoric industry or domain that existed between approximately 8000 BC and 6000 BC in the Sahara Desert during the African humid period referred to as the Neolithic subplume, which we just read earlier about Semites originating from. Craniometric analysis indicate that this early Paleocene population was closely related to the late Pleistocene Ibero-Maurusians, just like what indigenous Middle Easterners are related to, and early Paleocene Caspians of the Maghreb, as well as mid-Paleocene Maghreb groups. And so this is what the ancestors of Semites could have looked like and would have came from. This is a Kifian reconstruction, forensic reconstruction from the University of Chicago. And here are more reconstructions. Here's just a closer image, a little bit clearer. As you can see, they have dark brown skin, dark brown eyes, very dark brunette or black hair, and it seems to be wavy to curly. Based on the time period, location, and facial reconstructions, we can say 1. Saharan Ethiopid, 2. Red-brown to black skin, 3. Black woolly to curly hair, and 4. Dolichocephalic. Basically, Ibero-Maurusians would have looked African. So now, Natufians are said to be the ancestors of Semites. In this paper makes an additional inference since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic speaking peoples of the Levant. So, what did Natufians look like? So, here is the area of Natufian culture, basically in the Levant, from all the way from Sinai to Syria. And as you can see on the right hand side of the screen is a reconstruction of a Natufian. So this is from the New York Times, Negroid people. By the way, the New York Times in 1857. It says a Negroid people of 5000 BC. And this actually comes from Keith, a well-known archaeologist. And he says they were clearly a Negroid people, said Sir Keith, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads. They may have been the ancestors of the Arabs or Semites of biblical times, in Sir Keith's opinion. Several features stand out quite definitely. They were large headed people, the pre dynastic Egyptians. Secondly, are that they resemble pre-dynastic Egyptians. Thirdly, their faces were short and wide. Fourth, they were prognathous, which means that their jaw was projecting. Fifthly, their nasal bones were not narrow. Basically, they did not have a narrow nose and high. They were not narrow or high, but formed a wide, low arch. So they had wide noses. So putting everything together, these people had large heads, they had a promathic jaw, it protruded out, and they had a wide nose. All of this basically fits the so-called Negroid phenotype, and he even said that they were Negroid. But just to fully show you what it looks like, they have a wide nasal opening and a prognathism and long skull length. That's the Negroid phenotype. They also make classified African American phenotype as well. But a Natufian skull pictured in Beckhonden 2003 exhibiting many features consistent with recent African ancestry. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a Natufian skull, and he's basically saying that the skull it shows that there is like a type of recent African ancestry within the Natufians. And this is from Keith 1931. He says, has led has led me to the conclusion that all represent the same racial stock, talking about the Natufians. Remarkably was the nasal development of this cave people, often, most likely Negro-like in the flattening of the nasal bridge and in the width of the interorbital septum, such as might herald the pronounced nasal development of later Semitic races. And so basically, he's saying that the nose of the Natufians is very similar to a Negro, not like flattening of the nose, and that this nose structure may have later developed into the Semitic races that Natufians being the ancestors of. And so this also coming from Keith 1931 says, but with a distinct bias towards the African variety of that stock represented by the pre-dynastic people of Egypt, still observed by many Negro tribes in Africa. They remove one of or both upper central incisors in youth. And so basically he's saying he sees a lot of similar cultural traits with the Natufians and quote-unquote Negro tribes of Africa. Descriptions of Natufian and PPN remains, by the way, PPN, pre-Pottery Neolithic remains, consistently report post-pragmatic depression among other features consistent with sub-Saharan African ancestry. So again, they're saying that Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic remains, they seem to have some type of sub-Saharan African ancestry and or features. And here is one of the most recent papers dealing with the phenotype of Natufians, the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form. It is a further surprise that the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to have arisen, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis and the Egyptian Bronze Age samples from Naquata may also give a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. So as we can see on this chart from Figure 3, it has Niger-Congo and Natufian linked, and then prehistoric/recent Northeast Africa is also linked, but further back. But Natufians seem to be very close to Niger-Congo phenotypically. And then we see on Figure 4 that Natufians basically fall in between the Niger-Congo and the prehistoric/recent Northeast African when it comes to cranial. So it says, in conclusion, if the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance in the late prehistoric Eurasian element. And I think common looks very similar to the Natufian reconstruction from the nose to the lips to the cheekbones, the forehead, everything. The eyes. I think common is like a good modern representation of what the Natufians could look like. So based on the time period, location, and facial reconstructions, they would have resembled Niger-Congo sub-Saharan Africans. They would have also resembled recent/ancient Northeast Africans. So basically, Natufians looked African. Putting all this information together, we see that the ancestors of Proto-Semites, beginning with Basal-Eurasians to Ibero-Maurusians to Natufians, they all looked African, specifically more Sahelan. Therefore, the ancestors of Proto-Semites phenotypically were African in appearance. Here's putting all the information together from what a Basal Eurasian would look like, which would basically be a Upper Paleolithic person, to what a Ibero-Maurusian would look like, which is basically a Saharan Ethiopid, and to what a Natufian would look like. This is just one image showing what the ancient ancestors of what Proto-Semites would look like. Now, this African phenotype for the ancestors of Semites makes sense. Early Semites were Africans, and early West Asians resembled Africans. This is something we have to keep in mind. Remember what Christopher Ehret said. After all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. And this paper right here says that early West Asians resemble Africans. And that's from a comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. With that being said, what did the Proto-Semites themselves look like? In order to answer this question, let's return back to what we know about Proto-Semites. Early Semites, like Akkadians, expanded from the Levant to Mesopotamia. We should look at the most ancient Semitic civilizations. So, what are they? We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. Linguistically, by the way, we're going to look at the book To the Euphrates that covers the migration and early civilizations of Semites, such as Akkadians and Eastern Semitic people. It says linguistically, Akkadian is recognized as belonging to the Semitic family of languages, and analysis of cuneiform texts suggests that people speaking Akkadian were well established in the Elavun by the early dynastic 2 through 3 periods. The center of political control in Akkad was often considered to be Kish, based on our interpretation of the Sumerian king list. Gleb has suggested that the civilization aspects of the period between 2700 BC and 2400 BC in Akkad should be labeled Kish civilization. The Akkadians can be certain. The Akkadians can certainly be seen as the Matu predecessors in the 5th and 4th millennium BC, and perhaps Gleb's early Kish rulers, such as Scorpion, Fish, and Dog, may represent the earliest stratum for the 6th millennium BC. Since we have PP and B, pre-pottery Neolithic B, populations in the western Iraq as early as the late 7th millennium BC, and the earliest Umbud settlements of Akkad and Kish do not antedate circa 5500 BC. It would be safe to conclude that Semitic nomadic pastoralists began to settle in the northern Avalon from the western desert and interact with other populations as early as the 7th millennium BC, and that early Semitic populations came from regions to the west of the Central Euphrates Valley, and mountain Memphis, such as Jubal and Bereshit. One of the earliest Semitic settlements of the Akkadians was Umbud. So let's look at the Umbud remains to determine what early Semites could have looked like. Here is a paper that actually deals with the Umbud remains called Archaeology and the Sumerian Problem by Henry Frankfurt. And it says the people responsible for the Al-Umbud stage of culture belonged, to judge by their distribution, to the Middle Eastern section of the Mediterranean race, to the brown race of Christopher Elton Smith. In fact, but of their language we cannot say anything. As to the characteristics of the dolichocephalic population of Mesopotamia, Dr. Bringston distinguishes a brown Mediterranean and a brown Eurafrican type. They are, in fact, often included together in the term Mediterranean, but as distinguished by Dr. Bringston, the brown Mediterranean variety seems later and related with the West, whereas the Eurafrican type seems more ancient and has connections with the East. Brown Eurafrican variety of the dolichocephalic population at Kish and the other variety, the brown Mediterranean type, which is related with the West, can hardly have been anything but Semitic, for it is certain that we have to account the Mediterranean Semites from Arabia at an early date in Mesopotamia. So basically, they're saying that the brown Eurafrican or the brown Mediterranean type, it is Semitic. So what is the brown Eurafrican and brown Mediterranean? The Umbud remains were described, as such. So Sergei argued that the Mediterranean race had in fact originated in Africa, probably in the Sahara region, and that it also included a number of dark-skinned peoples from the African continent, such as Ethiopians and Somalis. Sergei also asserted that Semites were a branch of the Euro-Africans who were closely related to the Mediterranean. So he even believes that Semites are a Euro-African or Mediterranean, brown Euro-African or brown Mediterranean people. So Gwipsby Sergei, a much debated book, The Mediterranean Race, 1901, argued that the Mediterranean race had likely originated from a common ancestral stock that evolved in the Sahara region, or the eastern part of Africa, in the region of the Great Lakes, near the source of the Nile, including Somaliland, and which later spread from there to populate North Africa and the circum-Mediterranean region. According to Sergei, Semites are a branch of brown Eurafricans Mediterranean race. Furthermore, the Mediterranean race originated in Africa. So this is interesting because he places the origin of the Eurafrican in the same location for the origins of Semites, North Africa or the Eastern Sahara. Remember, the Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. Dinkoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northmost branch of Afro-Asiatic. Bench even wonders whether the highly divergent Greg languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. And this even matches the DNA. The overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afro-Asiatic having emerged in or near the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. The presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35/M78. Therefore, 2 phenotypes can fit the brown Euro-African, the Saharan Ethiopid and the North Ethiopid. So the Saharan Ethiopid. Ethiopid type that was more common during the Neolithic when the Sahara was green, reddish brown to black skin, tightly curly hair, dolichocephalic mesocephalic, and the North Ethiopid, common along the Red Sea coast in the Nile Valley from Egypt to Eritrea and deep into the Ethiopian highlands. These are the exact regions that we're covering. Often blend with Arabs and Yemenites that arrived in prehistoric times, sometimes in Arabia as well. Physical traits: dark, sometimes medium bronze brown skin, and tight curly hair. With that being said, what is another ancient civilization we can look into for the phenotype of ancient Semites? What is another ancient Semitic civilization we can use? So let's go back to this book. Linguistically, Akkadian is recognized as belonging to the Semitic family of languages. An analysis of cuneiform texts suggests that the people speaking Akkadian were well established in the Elavum by the early dynasty 2 through 3 periods. The center of political control in Akkad was often considered to be Kish, based on our interpretation of the Sumerian king list. Gleb has suggested that the civilizational aspects of the period between 2700 BC and 2400 BC in Akkad should be labeled as Kish civilization. So let's look at Kish. So Kish is in the lower part of the Euphrates and Tigris River, modern day Iraq, and it was believed to be possibly the center of Akkad. So Kish of Sumer in Mesopotamia, founded during the Umbud period, which we just mentioned, Umbud, and Kish was occupied from the Umbud period, gaining prominence as one of the preeminent powers in the region during the early dynastic period, which is what we just read. The Kish civilization is a time period corresponding to the early, this is what we're looking for, early East Semitic era in Mesopotamia and the Levant. Coined by Iglis Gleb, the epoch began in the early 4th millennium BC. The tradition encompasses the sites of Ebla and Mari in the Levant. Very interesting. The Proto-Akkadian sites of Abu Sahalik and Kish in central Mesopotamia, which constitutes the Uri region, as it was known to the Sumerians. The East Akkadian population migrated from what is now in the Levant and spread into Mesopotamia, which is what we've been saying this whole time, that Eastern Semitic people migrated from the Levant into Mesopotamia. And so the Sumerian civilization of Kish showed an East Semitic nature and revealed that the city population had a strong Semitic component from the dawn of recorded history. This is very important. Gleb considered Kish to be the center of this civilization, hence the name. And so the East Semitic languages are one of the three divisions of the Semitic languages. The East Semitic group is attested by three distinct languages: Akkadian, Ebelite, and Kishite, all of which have long been extinct. Kishite language is the oldest known Semitic language. Very interesting. So here are the early Mesopotamian city-states, and there is Kish highlighted in red, and there is Akkad. So Kish is another ancient Semitic civilization in Mesopotamia. Let's study what these people looked like. What are their remains? So here is a paper that literally goes over the remains found at Kish. It's called Report on the Human Remains Found at Kish. This report on the human remains found at Kish by the Field Museum and Oxford Expedition is based on the material excavated in the Old Sumerian Palace at eastern Kish. All remains from the palace, or in our terminology, Mound A, belong to the period immediately preceding the age of Sargon of Agad and are contemporary with the last fourth dynasty of Kish, circa 2900 through 2800 BC. The names of the 8 rulers of this period indicated clearly a Semitic dynasty. The population at Kish in the period to which the human remains of the palace belong should be therefore very mixed. Dr. Bingston finds 2 long-headed races in the palace skulls at Kish, which he designates as Euro-African and Mediterranean. So it's interesting, when it comes to the Kish civilization, we know that it's clearly a Semitic dynasty, and when it comes through to the remains, we see that they're Euro-African and Mediterranean. Now let's continue. A considerable development of the temporal muscles and is found typically in such skulls as those of Australian Aboriginals. The capal skull are well known and will give a clear idea of the appearance of the Kish type A. The forehead was retreating and the brow ridge was always prominent. The cheekbones are rather broad and the nose also was broad, in some cases indicating extreme praetorium. There can be little doubt that this type is that which has been described by Sergei uh, Fenderin Rigri and Fleury, the name the name and named the Euro-African type. So basically, they're saying that these skulls resemble, Australian Aboriginals, but also they're saying that basically these skulls are a Euro-African type. They have very broad noses and very long skulls. And this is interesting because this is basically what we covered earlier when it came to the Natufians, that their noses were often very wide and they also had a pronathonism when it came to their jaw, and that their skulls are very long, basically dolichocephalic. All this can fit the Negroid skull type just as much as the Australian skull type. And so, furthermore, the book continues to say there can be little hesitation in describing this type to the people who have been called by Elliott Smith the brown race. These two types both belong to a group of humanity which is classed as a single race by Hilton, who well apparently associating the brown race includes a further group, the Semites, of whom only one group, the Bedouins, here concern us. In any case, up to the present among the bones from Kish, with one or two doubtful exceptions, I have not found any definite examples of the people whom Haldane describes as Semites, whereas there are certainly examples of the brown and the Euro-African races. On a morphological examination, it would appear that two branches of one common stock are to be found among the types represented by the skulls from Kish. So basically, they're saying that the Semites of Kish look like the brown Mediterranean and the brown Euro-African, but all still having a single stalk. So Elliott Smith describes the Kish remains as the brown race. So what is the brown race when it comes to his definition? So this is from General History of Africa, and it says, particularly, when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white, Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being rather the mark. Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's Mediterranean or Euro-African race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. So, brown race could be basically, the same as saying a Negro. So here is Elliott Smith from his own words, The Ancient Egyptians and the Origins of Civilization, where he covers the brown race. He says, the Mediterranean and East African laterals into the whole peninsula of Arabia and to the shores of the Persian Gulf. In other words, Syria, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and Sumer were parts of the original domain of the brown race, the Proto-Egyptians, but there can be no doubt whatever that their dark hair was associated with dark eyes and a bronze complexion. Wall paintings and statues with dark eyes and ruddy brown skin. Brown skin and iris of a black or dark brown color, as the living populations of Northeast Africa, which most nearly resemble the Proto-Egyptians in stature, have a copper brown skin color. We must look upon the old Egyptian custom of representing men of their nationality with red skin. So basically, according to Elliot Smith, Semites are part of the brown race. And this is interesting because he places the origins of the brown race in the same location for the origins of Semites in the Horn of Africa. But before I go into that, the description of the brown race that Elliot Smith is connecting to, basically he's saying that they would have been a reddish, dark brown people with black hair and brown eyes. But let's also go into where he puts the origins of these people. So he puts the origins of the brown race in the Horn of Africa. Now, this is fairly interesting because we know that the Horn of Africa is actually one of the origins, one of the believed origins, should I say, for Semites. Dinkoff sees Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northmost branch of Afroasiatic. Now, Bench even wonders whether the high divergent Gureg languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia, with the rest of Ethiopic Semitic a later back migration. And as you can see on the image to the right, Bench has an origin of Semites coming from the Horn, the exact same place where Elliot Smith has the origins of the brown race. So this is fairly interesting. And of course, when it comes to haplogroup E, this is one of the believed theories for where E could have came from. The overall pattern is consistent with a model of the first speakers of Afroasiatic having emerged in or near the Horn of Africa or the Nile Valley. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syro-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35/M78. So, therefore, the phenotype that could fit the brown race is the East Ethiopid proper, showing the most prominent Ethiopic characters of all, common around the Horn of Africa in its purest form in the inland areas of Somalia and eastern Ethiopia. Dark reddish-brown skin, like what Elliot Smith said, curly to tightly curly hair, and dolichocephalic. So this is what early, or should I say, the ancestors, both the ancestors and Proto-Semites could look like, since we are dealing with the civilization of Kish and early Semitic people in Mesopotamia. So to conclude, Proto-Semites from ancient Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia, such as Umbud and Kish, they could have been described, they're described as this: the brown Mediterranean, the brown Near-African, and the brown race. What does all this basically mean in summary? Let's just break this down. So, when it comes to the Mediterranean race by G. Sergi, he says, this human species with cranial and facial characters thus well determined, I call Eurafrican, and this because having had its origin in Africa. And this is the passing of the great race, and it says, the Mediterranean race was first described by Sergi, who also calls it Eurafrican. The Mediterranean race originated in Africa and is closely related to the Negro, both being long-skulled peoples, descended from a common stock, the Eurafrican. And this is from Contribution to the Anthropology of Iran, and it says Eurafrican, hair dark, rather dark skin, fluid complexion, moderately tall stature, average, very long dolichocephalic skull, cheekbones somewhat broad, often slightly prognathinous, again projecting near the jaw, nose often broad, dark eyes. With rather close curly hair, prognathisms, and smaller measurements, this type with almost Negroid characters may be called with the Gramandi type. Eurafrican, this is by Hayden, who we mentioned earlier. Skin, dark. Hair, dark. Eyes, dark. Head, very long. Nose, often broad. Prognathism, often slight. Are they basically saying that Proto-Semites looked African? Is this what they're saying? Let's read from their own words. In a private conversation, he writes that this sequence is correct for Mesopotamia. As for an example at Kish, where the Mediterranean Proto-Semitic is under the Sumerian Alpine, he adds that the primitive Mediterranean type equals the Galas, etc. of Somaliland and Kenya colony, which in turn equals Proto-Semites. So basically, Proto-Semites look like people from their remains look like people from Gala or the Galas from Somaliland and people in Kenya. This is what Proto-Semites look like according to the remains. The best example could possibly be the Proto-Ethiopic type, ancient type that inhabited the southwestern Eritrean lowlands prior to the arrival of Ethiopians and possibly resemble early out of Africa types, was still common from Kenya to Sudan during historic times. Dark, sometimes medium brown skin and tight curly hair, dolichocephalic with robust, bony, and elongated features. Pronathenism is relatively pronounced. This is kind of what I would say a Proto-Semite would look like from everything that we've just read. So, I would say yes, the phenotype, description, and location are all literally in Africa. Proto-Semites likely looked African, which is no different than how their ancestors would look, who would be the Basal Eurasians to the Ibero-Maurusians and the Natufians. Semites of Mari now when it comes to artwork, we actually know sort of what they look like, what ancient Semites would have looked like. And Syria is one of the best places when it comes to looking at their artwork and the way that they depicted themselves. So Mari was an ancient Semitic city-state in modern-day Syria. It flourished as a trade center and hegemonic state between 2900 BC and 1759 BC. As a as a prosely as a purposely built city, the existence of Mari was related to its position in the middle of the Euphrates River routes. The Euphrates trade routes. This position made it an intermediary between Sumer in the south and the Ebelite kingdom in the Levant in the west. And so there is where Mari was, as you can see on the map. And below you can see what the people of Mari look like. And remember, these are Semites. Here's a closer image. Basically, dark brown skin, dark hair, and the eyes are likely dark as well. Here is another mural of people from Mari. Again, dark skin, dark brown skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. Here's another mural from Mari. Again, dark brown skin, dark eyes. And here is another mural from Mari, Syria. So the Semites of Mari, Syria are depicted with medium brown to dark brown skin, black hair, and dark eyes. This matches everything that we've covered thus far. Here's all the Mari depiction put together, so you can see everything on one image. So, from everything we've gathered so far, the ancestors of Proto-Semites, Basal Eurasians, Ibero-Maurusians, and Natufians, the Proto-Semites themselves, basically the remains found at Umbud and Kish, the way Semites depicted themselves in the murals of Mari, Syria. Proto-Semites would have looked African. Specifically, their phenotype would be dark skin, brown to black, hair color, black, hair texture, woolly to curly. Basal Eurasians, Ibero-Maurusians, Natufians, ancestors of Semites, and the Semites themselves, the Proto-Semites from Mare, Syria, an ancient Semitic civilization. And I have image to the left that kind of does fit with, with the exact same skin tone and hair texture and eye texture that we see. This is what Proto-Semites, early Semites, ancestors of Semites would have looked. So this is very important because it gives us an idea as to how the ancestors of Israel and the Israelites themselves and the descendants of Israel could look today if they remained homogeneous. From an old earth perspective, their phenotype could be African. After all, early Semites were Africans, and early West Asians resembled Africans. After all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. Christopher Ehret. Early West Asians resembled Africans. Again, this is from comparison of craniofacial features of major human groups. And to the right of the screen, I even have what someone made their own interpretation of what Proto-Semites would have looked like. And it's probably not wrong. It's probably exactly what they sort of would look like. And again, the Israelites themselves are Semites. This is very important, knowing who they are ethnically as a people. They are descendants of Shem. So, this is where I conclude when it comes to the origins of Proto-Semites, specifically from an old earth perspective. And hopefully y'all understood everything. Leave a comment if you have any questions. I'll be sure to answer them. And at the end of the full series, I will try to do my best to have a Q&A. But hopefully everything was understood.